Tarzan of the Apes. I took it home, read it from cover to cover, fell passionately in love with this glorious lord of the jungle. And what did Tarzan do? He married the wrong Jane.
Dr. Jane Goodall is considered to be the world's foremost expert on chimpanzees. She is best known for her more than 50 years study of the social and family interactions of wild chimpanzees. She's also the founder of the Jane Goodall Institute, and in 2002 she was named a UN Messenger of Peace. And she was actually awarded in 2007 an honorary doctorate degree in commemoration of Carl Linnaeus from Uppsala University. Today she travels the world speaking about the threats facing chimpanzees and the environmental crisis, urging each of us to take action on behalf of all living things and the planet we share. We're going to see a short movie, 1.5 minutes long, and right after that, please welcome Dr. Jane Goodall.
It's been an amazing journey, this life of mine. This planet has filled me with the wonder of all living things, great and small. We cannot ignore this earth that surrounds us, that feeds us, shelters us, replenishes our bodies and our souls, and stretches our imaginations, where animals, plants, air, water, all care for us. We're all interconnected, people, animals, our environment. When nature suffers, we suffer. And when nature flourishes, we all flourish. I do believe in the possibility of a world where we can live in harmony with nature, but only if every one of us does our part to make that world a reality. So that when you look back over your journey, your life, you can truly say, I did make a difference.
Thank you. I want to start off by thanking the person without whom I might not have done what I've done or be who I am, and that was my extraordinary mother. So I was born loving animals. I don't know, people say, but Jane, where did it start? I popped out of the womb loving animals. And my whole childhood was spent in observing all the different things living around me. And my mother supported this. So when I was 1.5 years old and she came into my room and found I'd taken a whole handful of earthworms and earth to bed with me, she, instead of getting angry, she said, Jane, they'll die if we leave them here. And we took them back into the garden. And, so many mothers would have said, oh, throw these dirty things away. She said, and I don't remember that, but she said, Jane, it looked as though you were curious as to how do they move without legs. At any rate, she supported my love of animals by finding books for me to read about animals, thinking I would learn to read more quickly, which I'm sure I did. I grew up in a time when there was no television, none of these modern electronic gadgets. Computers had yet to be invented. So we learned from books, from radio, and talking to each other. I grew up during World War II. And I was 10 years old when I discovered a little book in a second-hand bookshop, because we had very little money. And I just had saved up enough of my few pennies pocket money to buy it. And that book was Tarzan of the Apes. I took it home, read it from cover to cover, fell passionately in love with this glorious lord of the jungle. And what did Tarzan do? He married the wrong Jane. Well, he did, didn't he? Yeah. that was when my dream began. I would grow up, go to Africa, live with wild animals, and write books about them. Everybody laughed. How will you do that? You don't have any money. Africa's far away. It's the dark continent. And you're just a girl. Girls don't have opportunities like that. Dream about something you can achieve. But what my mother said to me, if you really want this, you're going to have to work very hard and take advantage of opportunity, but don't give up. And so many people have written or said to me, Jane, I want to thank you because you taught me that because you did it, I did it too. And it's my mother's message that I take around the world, particularly in disadvantaged communities. At any rate, the opportunity came when I was invited to Africa for a holiday. I hadn't been to university, we couldn't afford it. And this was the opportunity, but where was the money? So I went home. I had a job in London at the time. I went home and worked as a waitress, which, by the way, is very hard work. Eventually saved up enough money, got to Kenya, where my friend lived. And after a while, I heard about the late Dr. Louis Leakey. Jane, if you're interested in animals, you should meet Louis. So I went to see him at the Natural History Museum in Nairobi, and he took me all around and asked me all sorts of questions. And because I'd followed my mother's advice, I'd read books about animals, and I'd been hours in the Natural History Museum in London, I could answer most of his questions. And at any rate, that led to him giving me a job as his assistant, and that led to him inviting me to study not just any animal, but the one most like us, the chimpanzee. It was a study which began pretty badly, because as soon as the chimpanzees saw me, they ran away. I mean, they'd never seen a white ape before. And believe it or not, we are the fifth ape. You have the orangutan, the gorilla, chimpanzee and bonobo, and us. We are the fifth great ape. Like them, we have no tails. Anyway, gradually the chimpanzees began to get used to me. And one of them, David Greybeard, I called him, he had this beautiful white beard, and he's of all time my favorite chimpanzee. But he began to let me get closer. I still was using binoculars, but he didn't run away. And on this never-to-be-forgotten day, I saw him break off grass stems and use them as tools to fish termites from their nest. I saw him break off a leafy twig, and to use that as a tool, he had to remove the leaves and the side branches, and that's the beginning of tool making. If you saw that today, it wouldn't be exciting. But back then, it was, because science had decided that humans, and only humans, were the ones who could use and make tools. We were defined by Osman Hill as man the tool maker. And so I was very excited when I sent a telegram to Louis Leakey, and he wrote back and said, well, we have to redefine man, redefine tool, or accept chimpanzees as humans. It was that observation that enabled Louis Leakey to go to the National Geographic Society, and they agreed to fund my research when the initial funding ran out. So like Matthias, the National Geographic played a very important role in my life, and they sent Hugo van Lauwijk, a young photographer and filmmaker, to document the behavior which I was beginning to see more and more closely as the chimps got used to me. In a way, it was as though David introduced me to his friends in the forest, because I'd approach a group that was ready to run as usual, but if David was there, he sat calmly, and I suppose they thought, well, she can't be so frightening after all. And so gradually I was able to get a feeling for this extraordinary community of beings. And I learned that the community was about 50 individuals, but they didn't travel around in a troop, but rather sometimes alone, sometimes a mother and her dependent young, sometimes a group of males hanging out. Discover that the males are highly territorial and patrol the boundaries of this territory. I was fascinated to find that in chimp society, as in human society, there are good mothers and less good mothers. And looking back over the years, we see that the offspring of the good and supportive mothers do better. The males reach a higher rank in their hierarchy and sire more offspring, and the females are better mothers themselves. It's a very long bond between mother and child. The female doesn't have her first baby till she's about 13. One child every 5 years. When the next baby's born, the older child is still very dependent on the mother. So the bonds between mother and child get stronger, and between brothers and sisters as well. And I was fascinated to see how much of their non-verbal communication is like ours. Kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting on the back, swaggering, shaking the fist, begging for food. So similar. And that was why Louis Leakey sent me to study the chimps. He spent his life searching for the fossilized remains of early man. And he felt that there was an ape-like, human-like common ancestor about 60 million years ago, and that if Jane sees behavior similar or the same in chimps today and humans today, perhaps, maybe it was in that common ancestor and has come with us along our long, separate evolutionary journeys. And that's an idea which is very prevalent today. So he was delighted. I was shocked to find that chimps like us have a dark and brutal side to their nature. They're capable of a kind of primitive war in which members of a neighboring group will be killed. But they also show love, compassion, and altruism, just like us. Clearly there's no sharp line dividing us from them. And yet when I was sent to Cambridge by Louis Leakey, he said, you have to get a PhD, there's no time to mess with a BA. And I was very nervous. And so many of the professors told me I'd done everything wrong. I shouldn't have given the chimps names, they should have had numbers. I shouldn't be talking about their vivid personalities, their minds capable of thought, and I certainly couldn't talk about them having emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, despair, because those were unique to us. Well, fortunately, I'd had a wonderful teacher as a child who had taught me that in this respect, these erudite gentlemen were wrong, and that was my dog. You can't share your life in a meaningful way with a dog, a cat, a horse, a cow, a bird, whatever, and not know that, of course, we are not the only beings on the planet with personalities, minds, and feelings. Pretty obvious watching Matthäus's film of stills that this is true. And so, because the chimps are so like us also biologically, so that in composition of DNA, we and they differ by only just over 1%. And there are similarities, very, very striking similarities in composition of the blood, the immune system, the anatomy of the brain. So that science began to come out of this narrow way of thinking about our position in relation to the other animals. And that opened the door to seeing the amazing things we're now beginning to study about animal intellect, not just in the apes and the monkeys, the elephants, the bears, the dogs, but in birds, in the octopus. Even insects are being able to learn, be taught. And other insects, these are bumblebees, they can learn by watching the trained bumblebees. All of this is giving us a new way of thinking about the world we live in, the world that Matthäus has illustrated with his striking photographs and film. And when I got my PhD and went back to Gombe, I thought I'd stay there forever, out in the rainforest, which is where I love to be, where you realize the interconnectedness of all life forms. And I'd built up a research station. So why did I leave? Because in 1986 at a big conference, I realized as different chimp researchers, there were 7 different field sites by then, were talking about their chimp sites. It was clear that right across Africa, forests were disappearing. chimpanzee numbers were decreasing. There was the beginning of the bushmeat trade, the commercial hunting of wild animals for food. There was the lucrative killing of mothers to sell their babies for entertainment and pets. And it was so shocking. And there was also secretly filmed footage of our closest living relatives in 5-foot by 5-foot cages, bear cages, iron bars on each side, iron bars above, iron bars below, maybe if they're lucky a motor tire. And they were there in these medical research labs because their bodies are so like ours. Scientists who were delighted to have creatures so like us that they could be infected with our diseases, which other animals less like us could not be infected with. Scientists who were not prepared to admit the equally striking psychological and behavioral similarities. So when I left that conference, to which I'd arrived as a scientist, I became an activist. It wasn't a conscious decision. I knew I had to do something. And the first thing I did was to get some money. Again, the geographic helped, and went to Africa to learn firsthand more about the harm, the threats the chimps were facing. Because I don't think you can talk about something if you don't experience it firsthand. And I learned a lot about what was happening to the chimps, but I learned too what was happening to so many of the African people living in and around the forest habitats, the crippling poverty, the lack of good health and education facilities, the ethnic violence. Came to a head when I flew over the tiny Gombe National Park, looked down on what had been part of the great equatorial forest belt stretching from East Africa down through Congo Basin to the West African coast. And what had been part of that forest belt was now a tiny, isolated island of trees. It's only 35 square kilometers. And it's surrounded by completely bare hills, like the hills that Matteo showed you in that forest in Borneo. And it was very clear there were more people living there than the land could support, too poor to buy food from elsewhere. And the soil was over-farmed and infertile. The steep slopes where trees had been cut by people desperate to grow more food to feed their families, there was terrible soil erosion. The little streams were getting silted up. And the people were struggling to survive. And that's when it hit me. If we don't do something to improve the lives of these people, we have no hope of trying to save the chimps. And so the Jane Goodall Institute began a program called Take Care, or Takari we call it, improving the lives of the people in a very holistic way, which there isn't time to describe now. But gradually the villagers around Gombe came to trust us, and gradually they embraced the ideas that we presented to them. And I think this was because we didn't go in as a bunch of arrogant white people basically saying, oh, you've screwed things up and this is what we're going to do to improve your lives. No, it was a team of local Tanzanians. And eventually this program has become so successful that what began with 12 villages around Gombe is now in 72 villages throughout chimp habitat in this part of Tanzania, where the only wild chimpanzees live. Around Gombe, the forests are being restored, no bare hills anymore. And to the south, which is where most of Tanzania's wild chimps are, where the forests are still relatively intact, we use the same kind of program to protect the forests. And the villagers have now become our partners in conservation. So successful that this program is now in 6 other African countries. Lot of work, raising a lot of money to keep all this going. So what's the point if we're not raising new generations to be better stewards than we've been? And that's why I began our program for young people, Roots and Shoots, which maybe we can talk about later. But it began with 12 high school students in Tanzania in 1991. And today It's in 100 countries. We have members from kindergarten, university, everything in between. And its main message, every single one of us makes some impact on the planet every single day. And we have a choice as to what kind of impact we're going to make. Every single one of us has a role to play, even if we may not know what it is, in this complex tapestry of life. And each group, because I learned about the interconnectedness of all living things, each group chooses for itself. We don't tell them what to do. They choose 3 projects. It could be 3 in 1, but 3 projects. 1 to help people, 1 to help other animals, because we are animals, and 1 to help the environment. And so it's my greatest reason for hope, because when young people know the problems, when we listen to their voices and empower them to take action, they are so dedicated, so committed, so enthusiastic, so determined. And my second reason for hope is this amazing intellect of ours. And we've had with our first speaker, what an amazing example of the intellect to determine the mysteries of the universe way back beyond the formation of the universe. Unbelievable. And we are beginning to come up with technology, wind, solar, and so forth, that can help us live in greater harmony with nature. And in our own individual lives, we can make choices that will enable our own footprint to be lighter, our ecological footprint. My next reason for hope is the resilience of nature. We've already seen how the trees came back around Gombe. Animal species on the brink of extinction can be given another chance. I wrote a whole book about it. I got so inspired. Plant species can be given another chance. Social media is another amazing reason for hope, because for the first time in human history, people who care about, for example, climate change from all around the world, their voices can be brought together on one day to stand up, to stand firm, to demonstrate to the politicians and to business that we do care about the future of our children. And finally, the indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle what seems to be impossible and won't give up. And we all know people like that. So those are my reasons for hope. That's why, aged 84, I'm still trailing around the planet, which I don't... Thank you.
Dr. Jane Goodall.